Welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar on communicating for impact. My name is Gail Coulon and I'll be your host for today. I'm a managing consultant at Accenture. We are based in Oxford and we deliver innovation strategy advice, training and accelerator programs to organizations around the world. So in today's webinar, we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, which is communication. So before I became a consultant, I used to work as an academic. I was a researcher in neuroscience. And back then, science communication and public engagement were really starting to become hot topics in academia. And it's even more important today. So whether you work in industry or in academia, an important part of the role of a researcher or an expert is to be able to communicate sometimes quite technical concepts to a wide range of audiences who are not experts in your field. So whether you're writing a grant proposal or collaborating with partners in different sectors or pitching to investors or talking to your sales teams, communicating technical concepts effectively to a non-specialist audience is very important and can be quite tricky. But if you hone those skills, it's something that you can use to create a range of opportunities for yourself. So in today's webinar, we're going to be exploring some of these opportunities with our guest panelists. We are recording this session and we will share the recording with you later this week. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Ellie Hassan. Ellie is a policy analyst at the UK House of Lords. In her role, she briefs policymakers on technical topics and prepares researchers and experts to speak in front of committees. And she's currently taking a career break from that to finish her PhD at the University of Exeter. So welcome, Ellie. Next up, we have Laura Veldenz, who is a bid manager at Airborne, a company leading in advanced composites for the space, aeronautics, and marine industries. So Laura is an engineer by training, and in her current role, she sits in between the technical and sales teams at Airborne. So welcome, Laura. Then we have Ben. So Ben is a venture capital fundraising advisor at EIT Digital. He advises academic entrepreneurs as they prepare to pitch their startups and spin outs to investors. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Lee Thornton, who is the investment director at IP Group, a UK company that invests in and supports IP-based businesses. So welcome, Lee.
Hi.
So I have a few questions for our panelists today that we'll start with, all about communicating for impact and why it's important. But we'll also have time for audience questions. So do put those in the chat as we talk, and I will ask them to our panelists towards the end. So first of all, all four of you. So all of you have experience of working with researchers and experts in different contexts. So industry for Laura, policy and government for Ellie, and investment for Ben and Lee. So I wanted to start our session today by talking about what it means for researchers to communicate effectively to non-experts in these different contexts and why it's important. So Laura, let's start with you. So in your industry context, what does it mean for researchers or technical people to communicate effectively to non-experts and why is it important?
I think first of all, you need to kind of pick up your listener where they are. So quite often I find people kind of jump to conclusions as to what is knowledge that may be pre-existing. And that's quite dangerous because you kind of lose your listener straight from the get-go. They feel perhaps like they should know this because you're assuming they do. And that it just kind of goes downhill from there. And then little things add to it, like using abbreviations that are in your day-to-day communication of completely given, but perhaps a non-expert doesn't know and might not feel kind of at liberty to ask. So I think it's really important to understand where your listener is at and kind of pick them up where they are.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. So Ellie, same question to you. What does it mean for researchers to communicate effectively to policymakers in your case, and why is it important?
Yeah, so in policy, really, communicating effectively is about getting your message across in a way that whoever you're communicating with understands, and that promotes a constructive relationship with that person. The value in doing that really effectively, I mean, the biggest value is that you end up influencing government policy. And that obviously would have lots of benefits as a researcher if money ends up coming your way and things like that through grants. because the government have decided to focus on those areas in policy. But there's also other benefits to you as a researcher, like you can put these things in ref applications, obviously promotion applications and things like that. It really grows your profile. And also it gives you really good insight into how policy actually works, which can benefit the way that you approach your work later on. And there's obviously as well, if you're communicating well with someone, then it's going to be fun, it's going to be rewarding. So it's those other things as well.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. So then thinking about communicating to investors, so a different type of audience. Ben, tell us a little bit about what you think, why it's kind of important, your experience, of working with academic or technical entrepreneurs pitching to investors, and why it's important that they communicate well to investors.
Yeah, so I work with, quite often I work with academics who are kind of stepping out of the laboratory or the academic environment and engaging with angel investors or venture capital investors. Lee will appreciate this. And it's a sea change in how they have to think and speak to these new interlocutors that they have. Investors are people who are holding pots of money. It might be their own money, or it might be they might be managing money for other people. And as a consequence, they need to, their objective, it's important for the academics to understand their interests and motivations. And the investors typically, the technology and the research isn't actually paramount. They're keen to look at, they like technology and research, but the important thing is, can that technology and research translate into a business that's going to make money and generate returns for them or their investors? And that it's really important that the academic appreciates that, because it makes the conversation easier if they understand those background, the motivation of the investor. And because they're sitting on pots of money, they're busy. They're popular. There are a lot of people who are trying to talk to them and get their attention, and that can make them impatient because they're seeing so many different opportunities. So it's really important for the researcher to be very focused, be clear in presenting their ideas. Try, again, like the others have said, don't focus on the technicalities and the jargon, but really focus on what the opportunity is for investment and how the work that you've built in the laboratory or at the university can translate into something that's going to make somebody else some money and achieve their goals as well as yours.
Awesome, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Ben. Lee, anything to add on that in terms of what your experience has been with working with academic entrepreneurs?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. Apologies all for the lack of video. I'm having Zoom team issues, and I just had a Teams call, and I can't seem to get the camera to work on Zoom now. but never mind. Yes, so I'm Lee Thornton. I work at IP Group, which is a large UK early stage tech investor. We have investments across the UK with universities. Primarily, and so we do a lot of early stage investing, and consequently work an awful lot with academics. I think, to answer your question, what is key in communication between myself and my team and an academic? I think it's sort of two to three things. One is, for want of a better word, betterness. What is it you've done? Why is what you've done better? So have you made something that makes something else 10 times quicker, or 10 times lighter, or 10 times more efficient, or whatever it might be? So really understanding how much better something is and communicating that, obviously. And then on top of that, which is related, is how relevant is that betterness? So what have you done and why does it matter? And I do think that's sort of the key for research or an academic communication with the investor community. Is why is what you've done better, and how much better, to put another way. So betterness and relevance of that betterness are the two key things I'd leave you with.
Awesome, thank you, Lee. Cool. So that helps us set a bit of context of kind of why this is important, why good communication to these different stakeholders is important, and we're starting to discuss some of the things that we do well, and some things that technical individuals might not do as well when communicating. So let's go into those challenges and common pitfalls in a bit more detail. So let's start with you, Ellie. What are some of the common challenges or pitfalls you've seen when researchers or experts try to communicate with policymakers? Yeah, some of the things that you've come across, any examples that you can share with everyone.
Yeah, so Laura's already mentioned it. It's being too technical and too wordy, and those things often come hand in hand. And the reason they're problematic is because it affects the clarity of your message. You might have a really good point to make, but if you use technical language, it will obscure that point and also could sometimes confuse people. A lot of the members of the House of Lords that I work with they're very technically competent people, and a lot of them, you know, they have PhDs, they work in universities and things like that. But just because they are very educated doesn't mean they know the specific language in your area, and that can become a bit of a barrier sometimes. Also, when you're not communicating directly with a policymaker, you might be communicating indirectly with them through staff. So I have to write briefings for members of the committees that I work on. So I need to be able to understand the things that you put out there, both in written form and video form. So you need to bear that in mind as well. It could be someone like my background very likely is the background of the people that I'm working, the researchers that I'm working with to help the committee run some inquiries. So yeah, there's also a common issue where people will use language in a certain way without making it clear that that's what they mean. So as an example, my research is about fatigue, but fatigue means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So if I was talking about fatigue with a member of the House of Lords, I'd make it really clear exactly what sort of thing I was talking about, and that applies across the board. Yeah, certainly also when we get written evidence through, the written evidence that is, it just on the face of it is less clear, even before you get into it, is written evidence that has a lot of technical language in it and things like that. And the things that are focused on policy and focused on using simple language are much easier for both us and the members to delve through.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, no, I agree on the technical. Some terms are interpreted differently depending on different audiences. So for example, the term aerosol, to a climate scientist, they understand that as a tiny particle in the air, versus aerosol to anyone else is a spray can. It's very different interpretation. So it's really being conscious of those different words in different contexts. Awesome, thank you, Ellie. So let's go with Ben for next. Same question, what are the common kind of challenges and pitfalls you've seen when academic entrepreneurs pitch to investors?
Yeah, one challenge that pops up quite often, not always, but quite often, is that the researcher, the academic, thinks the investor is smarter than they are, that they know an awful lot about what they're doing in the lab. They have this assumption that because the investor is willing to have a meeting with them, they actually understand what they're talking about. And I think this is, and it's false premise, and it can lead to problems with communication. The researcher can again overload the investor with technical jargon, information that's not necessarily pertinent, and it's and as a result, the investor doesn't see what's really interesting from the opportunity from an investor perspective, so they miss it. And quite often they may just pass on the opportunity because it hasn't been clear enough, and the researcher has spoken to them at a much too high level in terms of technical know-how or understanding. So the job of the researcher is really to tone it down and make it easy to understand for anybody. Yeah,
awesome, thank you. So Laura, same question to you, kind of common when you're working between the technical teams at Airborne and the sales team, and you're trying to kind of translate that, what are the common challenges you've seen when the technical team try to explain things and communicate things to the sales teams, for example?
Well, I find, ironically, the biggest challenge is often listening, because loads of people have kind of their own agenda to push. So the engineers want to talk about all the exciting stuff they have developed, and they really want to discuss what amazing things they can do now. But actually, the customer really needs to understand whether they have a business case to invest. And really, no one really needs to know right now what all those amazing technical details are. Is really just important what's the throughput and what's the initial investment. So it's so critical to actually listen, stop thinking about what do I want to say, and actually instead respond to the question that was ultimately asked. And I think that would combat quite a number of things that were mentioned by my previous speakers.
Awesome.
And just a quick comment, Ellie mentioned fatigue. Well, for me as an engineer, fatigue is kind of components getting tired after being on an aircraft for 20 years. I'm not sure whether Ellie talked about that or maybe just getting a bit tired after sitting in a webinar for an hour. So good example on where things were very clear from the get-go.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I like that. Awesome. And Lee, what are your experiences of kind of common things? Yeah.
Yes, no, thanks for that. It's a good question. Common pitfalls, there's plenty of them, to be honest. I think I go back to what I said before, to be fair, in many respects, is explaining relevance. Often I hear inventions or disclosures or discoveries, whatever you want to term them. And it's hard to know how they really impact people. Academics can often be impressed that something is just better, but unless it's better in a meaningful way, it doesn't really matter. And that can be a bit of a barrier in terms of communication. One person believing it is better and the other saying, well, yeah, but does it matter? So I think communicating that is quite important. The other pitfalls are, when there is a world, there is a chasm between investors and academics, which I think both sides do try to cross and to reach out over. But one of the things that you need to listen to what questions are actually being asked by an investor and being able to respond to them directly. Because often people will in communication will think, you're asking that, but what you're really asking is this. And my response is, no, if I was asking that, I'd ask that. But what I'm actually asking is the thing I've asked. And that's a common pitfall, not quite answering the question. I mean, investors aren't there to try and undermine you, to try and belittle or cut a deal or whatever. They're there to understand. That's it. They're there to understand and make a decision about what you've done. And so the clearer you can make their understanding, the better you can make their understanding, the better for all of you, frankly. So answer the question you've been asked, basically, and contextualize why what you have done is relevant, important, better in the real world.
And that's an interesting point. That kind of mirrors also what Laura was saying earlier about like actually listening and not just
exactly. I mean, it's the essence of communication, isn't it? Hearing and listening are quite different things, and communication requires both of those things. So yeah, in just trying to reach out to others and trying to understand why they're asking it, and understand if they really are asking what they're asking, which they usually are, I would say, or if they're not. But yeah, trying to get a person's perspective is essential to that.
Yeah, awesome, great. Well, thank you for that. That's really helpful. That's really insightful. All right, so then the next, my next question was, if you had kind of recommendations or advice for an expert or a researcher who wants to communicate with, so for example, policy for Ellie, or industry partners, Laura, investors for Ben and Lee, what would be your kind of maybe top 3 recommendations or top 2 recommendations to give? So let's throw it on this head. Let's start with Lee. What would be your recommendations if you were expecting to meet an academic entrepreneur next week and they were pitching to you? What would be your advice to them?
That's a good question. There's a million ways to tackle this, and to be honest, I change my view on what I want to hear and what the best way to communicate is on a regular basis, because there isn't a right answer. But what are the things that I think would make me feel positive about what I'm hearing? I think something that's genuinely impactful. I think something that's big, a big idea, a big change, a really positive change makes a big difference. I think that's a really key thing to get across. And then, so maybe you asked for 3, that's 1. Secondly, passion. Like ultimately, if you're communicating to me what you've done and you want me to look into it and maybe invest in it, I want to know you really care. And because I think if you care, then I know you'll be able to deliver something. So showing passion and why you like what you do, and why you've got to do what you do, all that background, but show some passion, I think is really important. And then 3, I think understanding the field in a broader context. I think that really impresses me. When I speak to an academic who says, I've done X and Y, I've got a new material that does this, and that's it. So I think, well, that's okay. But when someone says, I've got new material, and the way to commercialize it is to talk to engineers to fix this, this, and this, and then I'll talk to the modelers, and the modelers be able to explain how to do this, this, and this, and then what you need to do next is take it this way and do this, this. And I think, wow, that's really something. So again, it's that word contextualize, is put your thing in the wider picture and explain to me how it gets to an end product or an end service or whatever. So that's sort of my three things there.
Awesome. That sounds great. So Laura, same question to you. What would be if a new technical person were to join your team tomorrow, what would your advice be to them?
Well, I was more thinking, first of all, about my advice to researchers, actually. Yeah. So if you don't mind me starting with that.
Yeah, of course.
Because I also have a research background, so it's more out of experience here, but it's practicing. It sounds really silly, but I think no one can be expected to give a great pitch just standing up in the morning and go do it. So when I went to my first conference, I actually had some friends over and I gave my whole presentation to them, and everyone had to give me feedback. And you kind of create your own safe environment where you feel comfortable to make mistakes and get some just completely new feedback. And did you tell your story right? And did it actually arrive that people get the message, or find completely different environments? So you mentioned science communication at the very beginning. It's another relatively safe environment because it's not that relevant for your career in the end of the day. So I volunteered for an organization called Pint of Science, which was about bringing researchers into a pub. And you have the advantage that most people have a pint or two and don't remember too much about it. But you get on a stage and you have the stage fright, and you can really practice giving your kind of pitch to a layman's audience. So as silly as it sounds, and as much kind of it takes for you to do that is to practice. And if I was to speak to my engineers and give them some advice, I would probably look a bit different, because of course I wouldn't necessarily advise to practice an informal discussion. But yeah, I personally just keep asking, and eventually I think there is an understanding that you do need to start at the beginning effectively. And so I keep on doing that, and that kind of helps. And it goes back to my first point, pick the people up where they are. Don't make any assumptions. So
that's awesome. Thank you. And you, Ellie, what would be your recommendation if you were to kind of prepare either a researcher or an expert to speak in front of a committee? What would be your advice, your recommendations to them?
So if you're appearing in front of a committee and you're speaking directly to policymakers, you need three things. You need clarity, you need purpose, and you need confidence in what you're saying. So if you can communicate a really simple message to the members of the committee with confidence, that's really easy for them to it's easy for them to remember, it's easy for them to mull over, and they can probe it if they want to. And it will also pique their interest and probably help them find more things that they're interested in. But you also need to remember that appearing in front of the committee that's not the whole deal. Communicating with policymakers, there's loads of different ways, indirect ways of communicating with people in policy. So lots of resources that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So have your website having some videos on YouTube or something like that if you're talking about your research and its relevance to policy. Have your blog, writing a white paper, even having your social media and being active on there. All of these things are ways of communicating with people in policy. They're not any different to you and me. They have Twitter, they go on LinkedIn, things like that. So don't just think, when you're thinking about, how can I communicate with someone in policy, don't just think you need to send something in to an inquiry, or you need to meet with a member or email them or something like that. Really diversify the way that you're getting your research out there and how it's relevant to policy, because it probably will get picked up if you make it visible enough.
Awesome. And you were mentioning, I think, once that helps when you're looking for someone to invite to a committee. That's what you look for as well, is who has the most presence and can I easily find them.
Yeah, the more information I can get about what exactly it is someone does, and how good they are at talking to an audience, the easier it is for me to do my job. And when we're on really tight deadlines, which we sometimes are, we're going to go for the people that we know most about quickest. So
yeah, awesome. Thank you. And Ben, what would be your advice to kind of budding academic entrepreneurs who are
there's so many
looking to
things there's so many things to talk about, but I guess the first one is you need to be a bit of a storyteller. So when researchers are talking to venture capital investors or other investors, they really need to explain to the investor why they're making something that people will want to use and to pay for. And the best way to, and it's important that the researcher actually had some evidence to show that that's the case, or they think it might be the case. So it's important that they probably have gone out and spoken to potential users and potential buyers and share the stories that they're getting from those potential customers with the investor. There's nothing better than a great story of somebody who's possibly tried your technology or your product and liked it and said, look, we'd like to use this. Maybe it's not perfect yet. They've got some feedback on, where the weaknesses are, or where the strengths are. And if you can share these kinds of customer stories or user stories, that's really, really powerful. It makes it much more convincing for the investor, because really at the end of the day, the job of when you're engaging with investors is to convince them that you've got something that's worth investing in and putting their money into. And what, at the end of the day, I think it's really being believable. And there's no better way to be believable than to actually believe it yourself. It's awfully hard to convince somebody that you're worth investing in if you're not entirely convinced yourself. So the best way to get convinced about the possibilities of the potential of a business is to go out and actually talk to people who you think might buy what you're building. And if you're getting good feedback on that front, it makes it much more believable for you and hence more believable for the investor.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's very obvious when someone does not believe in what
it's obvious. It's obvious when you hear it, but it's not always obvious initially for people, especially people who've been working in universities, and it's not something they're used to doing.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Well, thank you for that. So I'm just looking in the chat. We have a couple questions from the audience that we can go through. First of all, there was a vote of support for Pint of Science. So clearly, a few people in the audience have been to some of those events before. So it's great to see. So one question from Amanda. This is to Lee and Ben from the kind of investor angle. What are the institutional barriers you encounter when working with universities? I guess there are multiple, but if we're kind of thinking about it from a communications perspective, are there kind of any institutional barriers that you can think of when you work with universities?
It's difficult to answer. Are they specifically runs into communication? I mean, I prefer to go direct to an academic and to have that conversation. That the sort of the office at the university, the tech transfer office, is very helpful in helping to be that bridge. But it's in between the outside world and the academic. But it's important, I think, to establish a direct link to answer your questions and to have a greater understanding. I think universities are quite good at trying to communicate and trying to publicize and advertise what's going on in their researchers. But I don't think the barrier is really one of them. There's many barriers for commercialization. It's hard and to turn ideas into investable companies. But I don't think communication is so much the difficulty. In this goal, it's not the main barrier, I think. I don't know, what does Ben think?
Gosh, it's difficult. It's always different for every case, but I think tech transfer offices and innovation offices at universities can be very, very helpful. In my experience, there's been magnificent technology that's being developed inside the university, and the researcher really hasn't thought about it much commercially. And a bright spark in the technology transfer has spotted it and said, look, there's great promise here. Spent a bit of time on it, polished it up a little bit in a way that is interesting for investors and taking it out to market, and we've seen success that way. So I think university tech transfer groups and others, they have a really important role to play to bridge that divide. That being said, I agree with Lee entirely. The university researcher is, that's the inventor of the technology. They are they play a central role in moving it forward and commercializing it. So it's really important that the investors are communicating directly with them and not working entirely through intermediaries. After all, if there's a business to be built around the new technology, that researcher will probably be playing a role as one of the founders of the business. So that's really important that they're engaged from the very beginning.
Yeah, this kind of leads on to a question from another audience member: is thoughts on the CEO or the business development person pitching the business rather than the academic?
Well, I'll just say that they're quite often, the research is really integral. The inventor understands the technology. And quite often, not always, but sometimes that researcher becomes the CEO of the company or the managing director. But more often than not, they don't. It's somebody with more business experience steps in, somebody who can sell, somebody who understands how customers think and who has experience building products. So it just depends on the skill set of the researchers. Some of them become fantastic salespeople and business people, and others prefer to be researchers and technologists. It's just a matter of skill sets and personalities. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you. So I guess this next question I have is kind of for all of you, but it stems from a point that Ellie made about videos and blogs and social media, and using that to kind of to start that communication with the range of audiences. So do you feel like professional support for researchers to build their online profile is worthwhile investment? Kind of how do you feel about that as a way of kind of helping them to communicate with a wider range of audiences? Anyone wants to pick up on that?
I'll start if that's okay. So I think when I talk about these things, I'm not saying they have to be super polished. So literally something as simple as a YouTube video that's a recording of a talk you gave at a conference gives me so much information about like how good a speaker you are and what your research really relates to, because often in those talks, people will tell you the context of their research right at the start. So whilst I think, there could definitely be value in investing in those things, I wouldn't say it's necessarily there's not necessarily a need for it. It's more just trying to make sure that the things that I suppose it's making your work more accessible, really. But that's posting a video or writing a blog that summarizes some work that you did or something like that. And I'm also that in policy you don't necessarily get the tangible payoff, so I think it might be difficult to make kind of a business case for putting lots of money into that. But I'd like to hear obviously other people's thoughts. Would be quite interesting.
One point I would make is often communication is the way you explain something might resonate well with one person but might not with a different person, and sometimes taking different approaches to communicate the same topic will reach different audiences. So having different ways of doing that through writing or through talking or through different media helps you to kind of make the same point but in different ways, so you can reach a wider audiences. Anybody else have any thoughts on that, on kind of investing into helping researchers build their online professional profile and communicating what they do online? Any thoughts?
It's just my opinion here, but
of course.
I think it needs to be done well. There's no value in kind of, I don't want to say half-assing it here in a public forum, but there's no value in kind of doing something because I really feel I need to. I think it's about finding the vehicle that suits your personality. And some people like writing, so it's a blog, and other people love Instagram, and so it's that. And that should be kind of the driver there. I don't think it's desperately needed, and if it's just not your way of doing it, it seems awkward and forced. So that would be my personal take on it. But yeah, I think there's always a vehicle. You just need to find the one that suits you.
Yeah, fair. Awesome. Any thoughts from Ben or Lee on that?
I think an online, you're asking specifically around an online profile, I guess, and is that useful? To a degree, but to be honest, the level of detail you require when exploring something from an investor perspective is much better sort of face-to-face, or reading a paper or something, an academic paper. So I don't know, an online presence probably doesn't weigh so much with me, just, you know, I've stayed a bit quiet, I guess.
Cool. Awesome. Great.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's, you know, it's probably useful for the researcher to have an online profile, but from the investor's perspective, I think they would just prefer to pick up the phone and have conversation with that researcher and get the nuts and bolts. Yeah. Cool.
Great. So a question this is from Mai, this is for you, Ellie. So it's about policymakers. So is it better, she asks if it's better to kind of focus on areas that they're already interested in, or kind of bringing them into new areas that they might not have considered kind of outside their focus. If you're a researcher and you're trying to kind of push a particular message, what would you approach that?
So it's a really good question. I'm glad that you only just asked it, because I got a bit of time to mull over my response. So in my experience, generally, if you are providing information about something that they haven't specifically asked about, or if you're going, what to them could seem kind of off topic, that can be successful if you make it really clear why. So as long as you're covering the reasoning that's relevant to the thing that they are interested in, then that can be really successful. And obviously you are the expert in the thing, so if you think it's relevant, they would like to hear about it, most likely. But definitely don't skip over the thing that they're interested in to tell them about something else, because that can kind of get lost in everything else that's going on.
Cool, awesome. We have a question from Arif. Asking to ask him out loud. Let me see if I can do that. Yes, I think I can. Arif, would you like to ask a question to our panelist?
Yes, no, thank you very much, and apologies for sort of interrupting. I just came in a few minutes after you'd started. If you can hear me clearly, my question is simply around what you've been talking about in terms of getting, sort of strengthening this communication channel. My question is around, to what extent do you think we can be much more effective at using networks in particular that are aligned to, areas that may be relevant here? So there are quite a number of networks in the Commonwealth space that bring together policymakers, that bring together the private sector, that bring together the research community. But here's the point. Nobody knows about them. They're not very well known, and some of them are very active, some are less active. I think the UK is actually, ironically, one of the worst countries in terms of its engagement with Commonwealth networks, because they, for whatever reason, whether it's because the UK for the last 30 years has been looking more towards Europe, or whatever the reason is, but I think there is a real opportunity for looking at Commonwealth networks, because not only does that open up dialogues with governments through high commissions in London, it also taps into networks around, whether it's around STEM or whether it's around involving women entrepreneurs, but also it links into the diaspora as well, which are also part of the UK research landscape. And I just wanted to footnote this to mention that we've been working, I sit on the board of the Commonwealth Businesswomen's Network. We've been working closely with Exeter for the last few months and the Global Entrepreneurship Network in the UK to develop a women's entrepreneurship accelerator, which I think has highlighted the value of how the Commonwealth can be leveraged to support some of these broader objectives. So that my question is, how can we make better use of some of our external networks to support the outreach, engagement, and understanding of what you're trying to talk about today? Thank you.
Thank you. Any thoughts from our panelists about that? So using networks to kind of improve engagement and communication across different stakeholder, different groups, so the academia, private sector, public sector, that kind of thing.
I mean, it's a broad question, isn't it? Depends what you're trying to achieve in terms of how to use your network. But I guess a lot of referrals or conversations I have that come to me or through a network, so people I've met previously have sort of passed on my details or recommended or not recommended, perhaps on occasion, that people speak to me. So it is useful, if from my perspective, if you're an academic, ask around your universities and departments, you know, who in the investor community have you spoken with, who was receptive, who might be interested. That's a useful way to reach out to your network. I mean, the question was maybe specifically around more Commonwealth networks. I mean, investment does tend to be quite different depending on your geography. So an investor's appetite in the US and Canada or Australia is different to what it might be in the UK. So the networks might be of some use in that context, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Just on that note, the world of venture capital is very much a networked world. Relationships are built on social networks. It's a great deal of it is based on trust. It's kind of informal quite often. It can be quite difficult actually to get a meeting with an investor without having a warm introduction, say, from somebody else in your network. So knowing people who know people is really, really valuable when the time comes to be looking to raise some early stage investment or venture capital, because the world of money works through fairly informal social networks. So it's the job of the researchers who are trying to raise money is to keep on networking and don't be shy about attending events and talking to people and reaching out and asking questions and trying to find people who are sort of outside of your normal network. Academics, there's an academic world and they have their networks with people who are other universities or other departments. Well, if you have aspirations to build something that's commercial or build a business around it, you have to step out of those comfortable networks and join into new ones.
Yeah.
It's a really important part of the whole process.
And it comes back to what kind of Laura and Ellie were saying about it's building your network and building your profile, whatever that looks like.
Yes.
And as a way of engaging more with a wider range of audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, because the real value can come from people who you never dreamt would be able to help you in the past. It's quite often serendipity, which is happens. Serendipity happens more often when your network is big.
For sure.
And then on the other point was the Commonwealth. I'm originally from Canada, and the Canadian High Commission hosts events all the time, and they bring in investors, they bring in businesses who are interested in university innovation and what's going on at the university. So in the case of the Canadian High Commission, it's worth people finding out what they're doing. And
bizarrely, I can jump in there, Ben. I used to work for the Canadian High Commission and run those types of events.
Oh, very good.
So I left at 50/50, but I worked at the tech and science side.
Right.
That's exactly what I did. I wonder if we bumped into each other, but Canadians are very good at this in particular, but lots of embassies do that.
Yeah.
This is a great example of what you're just saying, Ben, of the bigger the network, the serendipitous.
Well, there you go. We've just connected there.
There you go.
Through something I would never have dreamt that Lee and I would have had in common.
It's a small world, to be honest. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome. So I'm conscious that we're almost out of time. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up things. Laura, was there an extra point you wanted to add? I saw that you were trying to jump in there.
Yeah, just from a kind of sales perspective, it's the same idea. You kind of sell through networks, and that's why the last 2 years have been particularly difficult. I would say it's been quite a challenge to do that sort of networking, and we're all kind of excited for things to finally taper off and we can actually go shake hands with each other. But yeah, to my previous point of kind of practicing, I would also just keep going to any sort of event or get engaged in any sort of organization as much as possible, because it's also something that I don't think comes super natural to every one of us to kind of open up a conversation with a stranger. It does take a little bit of practice, and I would recommend anyone that if your university offers something, just go to it, and then kind of work yourself up to international events that might seem a bit more intimidating in the beginning.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. So I'll just kind of recap some of the main points that we covered today. So really getting your point across to your target audience, whatever that may be. So thinking about kind of why do they care and getting straight to that point. Also, a few of you mentioned listening to what you're actually being asked. That's really important. And then finally, kind of, growing your online profile, your network, and getting engaged where you can is going to be a great way to build that communication experience and to engage with a wide variety of audiences. So just to kind of wrap up, so at Exeter, we've developed a series of workshops designed to help researchers and experts do exactly that, so hone their communication skills and practice communicating effectively to a wide range of audiences through discussions and practical exercises. So if this is something that you're interested in, please do get in touch and we'd be happy to talk to you about that. So on that note, I wanted to thank our panelists, Ellie, Laura, Ben, and Lee. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. That was a great discussion, and thank you everyone for joining. And we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.